the heart of the Louisiana swamps, where the fog hung heavy over the moss-draped cypress trees, the Dupree brothers had carved out their lives. They were no strangers to the harshness of the world. From the time they were boys, the swamp had been both their sanctuary and their prison. Their father, the patriarch of the Dupree family, had taught them everything they knew about moonshine: how to distill, how to hide, and most importantly, how to survive. Wade Dupree, the eldest of the four brothers, stood at the edge of the muddy creek, the scent of wet earth and rotting leaves filling his nostrils. His worn, weather-beaten face reflected the years of struggle. At 40, he carried the weight of the family's legacy on his shoulders. His brothers Connor, Jesse, and the youngest Travis had each taken their place in the operation. Together they had built a thriving moonshine business, supplying the illicit alcohol to locals and even selling it under the table to bars in nearby towns. But despite the wealth they had accumulated, there was no escaping the truth. Moonshining was a dangerous game. In the thick of the swamp, trust was hard to come by, and betrayal was often just a breath away. Wade's thoughts turned to their most recent deal. The Dupree brothers had partnered with a group of outsiders, a couple of men from New Orleans, who promised to help distribute the moonshine to new customers. But Wade had grown suspicious. The outsiders were too eager, too quick to strike deals. Wade knew better than to trust anyone outside the family. It wasn't the first time Wade had felt a shift in the air. The swamp had its own way of revealing secrets, and over the past few months, Wade had felt an undercurrent of tension that wasn't there before, a sense that something or someone was about to break. He turned to his brothers who stood behind him, each with their own thoughts. Connor, the second oldest, had served in Vietnam, and his hardened demeanor reflected the battles he had fought, both abroad and at home. Jesse, the thoughtful one, was always lost in books or scheming ways to expand the family business. And Travis, the youngest, eager but impulsive, often acted before thinking. As Wade prepared to return to their shack, the muffled roar of an engine reached his ears. Someone was coming. A truck, no doubt. The brothers had learned long ago to keep an eye out for strangers. Wade's hand instinctively moved to the revolver at his hip, but as the truck came into view, he relaxed. It was only the local sheriff's deputy, Earl White, a man they had known for years. "Morning, Wade," Earl said as he stepped out of his truck, tipping his hat. "Mighty fine day for a visit, huh?" Wade gave him a curt nod. "What brings you out here, Earl?" "I heard some talk," Earl began, his voice lowering. "Seems some folks are getting real curious about your little operation. You know how it is. The longer you stay in business, the more eyes start to pry." Wade's heart sank. He'd been expecting trouble, but not so soon. He locked eyes with his brothers, and he saw the same unease reflected in their expressions. The family's moonshine had kept them afloat for years, but it was only a matter of time before someone wanted a piece of it. Earl continued, "Just be careful, Wade. Folks out there don't play fair." With a tight smile, Wade replied, "We're always careful, Earl." But deep down, he knew this warning was just the beginning. The end was coming, and it wasn't going to be pretty. By the time the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting the swamp in a dusky golden glow, Wade had already made up his mind. The warning from Earl had been enough to convince him. There was no more time to wait. He gathered his brothers at the cabin to discuss their next move. Connor was already sharpening his hunting knife, his focus unshaken. Jesse was at the table, scribbling notes, as usual, but the crease in his brow revealed the storm brewing within him. Travis, always restless, paced back and forth in the corner, the tension in his shoulders palpable. "Something's not right," Wade said, standing before them, his voice low but firm. "I don't trust those men from New Orleans anymore. They've been circling us for too long. If they wanted to help, they'd be showing up with their hands open. Instead, they're testing the waters." Connor looked up from his knife. "So, what are we going to do about it?" Wade didn't answer immediately. He could feel the weight of the decision on his chest. Betrayal had always been the highest crime in their family. It was something that could never be forgiven. He looked at each of his brothers, his gaze lingering on Travis, who seemed to be itching for action. "We're going to take the barrels back." Travis grinned. "I'm with you, Wade. Let's make sure they never forget who runs this swamp." Wade's eyes hardened. "This isn't about just taking back what's ours. This is about sending a message. Nobody steals from the Dupree family and gets away with it. We're going to drown them out in the swamp where nobody can hear them scream." The brothers nodded in agreement, each of them understanding the gravity of Wade's words. This wasn't just a robbery. This was an act of war. And when it came to protecting their family's livelihood, there were no rules. That night, under the cover of darkness, the Dupree brothers made their move. They followed the narrow dirt roads leading out of the swamp, the sound of their boots muted by the thick fog that rolled in from the bayou. The moonlight barely penetrated the haze, but Wade knew the land like the back of his hand. He could navigate it blindfolded. When they arrived at the makeshift distillery run by the men from New Orleans, the place was eerily quiet. The trucks were parked in a row, barrels of moonshine stacked high. Wade's pulse quickened as he motioned for his brothers to spread out. They would strike fast, overwhelm the thieves, and get out before anyone could raise an alarm. But as Wade moved toward the barrels, a loud shout broke the silence. "What the hell are you doing here?" It was one of the men from New Orleans, a tall figure emerging from the shadows with a rifle slung across his back. Before Wade could react, another voice echoed from the opposite side of the distillery. "Looks like we've got some company, boys." It was a trap. Wade cursed under his breath as the brothers sprang into action. Gunfire rang out in the distance as the New Orleans men began to take cover, preparing for the fight they had been expecting. But the Duprees were no strangers to combat. As the fog thickened around them, they fought back, their anger and determination driving them forward. In the end, the Dupree brothers did what they had to do. They drowned the men in the swamp, sinking them beneath the water and mud, erasing all traces of their existence. But as they stood over the bodies of their enemies, Wade felt no satisfaction. The bloodshed had been necessary, but it had cost them more than they realized. The message had been sent, but now they were marked. And in the stillness of the Louisiana swamp, Wade knew one thing for sure. Their world had just changed forever. The air was thick with the dampness of the swamp, its oppressive humidity wrapping itself around the Dupree brothers like a shroud. The night after their bloody confrontation, the fog hung low in the air, creeping like a ghost through the cypress trees. Wade sat outside the cabin, staring out at the sluggish water that wound through the bayou. His mind was a storm of thoughts, replaying the events of the previous night over and over again. He hadn't wanted things to escalate that quickly. Sure, the men from New Orleans had betrayed them, but Wade never thought it would come to this. Murder, blood spilled in the name of family pride. The swamp had always been their refuge, their world of survival. But Wade knew the truth now. Nothing stayed untouched forever. The calm of the bayou couldn't wash away the blood on his hands. Connor came out to join him, a cigarette dangling from his lips. His steady gaze met Wade's, as if he was reading his thoughts. Connor didn't say anything. He never had to. The two brothers had an understanding, a bond, formed from years of hardship, war, and survival. But Wade could see the weariness in Connor's eyes, the same look he'd seen when they buried their father. It was the look of a man who had seen too much, done too much, and now carried the burden of it all. "What's next?" Wade finally asked, his voice hoarse, as though the weight of his question was too much for him to bear alone. "We clean up the mess," Connor replied. "But we can't stay here much longer. We've made our point, Wade. The word will spread fast, and it won't be long before someone comes looking for revenge." Wade nodded, rubbing his hand over his face. "You're right. It's only a matter of time. But they can't find us. We've got to disappear." It wasn't just the men from New Orleans that they had to worry about. Word of their actions would travel fast. Moonshine was a delicate business, and when blood was spilled over stolen barrels, everyone in the region would be on high alert. The Duprees had worked hard to carve out their place in the underworld of Louisiana's illicit alcohol trade, and they weren't about to let it all crumble now. "We've got the barrels back, but the truth is, this operation, it's bigger than us now," Jesse said from behind them. Wade hadn't even heard his brother approach. "We're not the only ones in this business. There are other players, bigger ones." Wade's jaw tightened. He knew what Jesse meant. While the Dupree brothers were well known in the region, they weren't the only moonshiners who ran the backwoods of Louisiana. The swamps were a treasure trove of secrets, and any number of men would be willing to step in and take what they had built. What was worse, some of those men would stop at nothing to erase anyone who got in their way. "We've got to be smart about this," Jesse continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "We need a plan. We need to disappear, lay low, and figure out how we're going to take control back from whoever's coming after us." Wade sighed. He wasn't ready for another fight. The swamp had already taken so much from him. The loss of their father, the burden of running the operation, and now this massacre that weighed heavily on his soul. But he knew Jesse was right. They needed to regroup. And in the quiet, oppressive darkness of the swamp, Wade began to realize that the Dupree brothers were about to be dragged into something much bigger than the local moonshine trade. The swamp was a place of secrets, and it seemed that the Duprees had just become a part of a much darker secret, one that none of them had prepared for. The Dupree brothers had never been ones to back down from a fight, but now, with their operation in jeopardy, they found themselves facing a far greater challenge than anything they had encountered before. The stolen barrels had been returned, but the men they had killed were only the beginning of a much larger and more dangerous web of deceit. The morning after the massacre, Wade sat at the kitchen table, staring down at the pile of papers and receipts scattered before him. He hadn't slept, the weight of their actions pressing on him like an anchor. The moonshine business had always been a way of life, passed down from his father and grandfather, but now it felt like a curse. Every step they took seemed to drag them deeper into something dark, something that could destroy everything they had built. "There's more to this than just stolen moonshine," Wade said quietly, his voice betraying his exhaustion. "The men we killed weren't just thieves, they were working with someone else." Connor, sitting across from him, raised an eyebrow. "What are you saying?" "I don't know yet," Wade replied, "but I can feel it. There's something bigger going on here. The men we killed, they weren't just looking for money. They were after something more." Jesse, who had been leaning against the doorframe, spoke up. "You think it's another gang? Someone else wants to take over our turf?" Wade shook his head. "No. It's not just about territory. It's about power. Whoever's behind this has been watching us. They know how valuable our recipe is, and they're willing to kill to get it." Travis, who had been unusually quiet, finally spoke. "You're saying we're not done yet, that they'll come back for us?" "They already are," Wade said, standing up and pacing the room. "The barrels, the bloodshed, it's just the beginning. We've got to find out who's behind this before it's too late." As Wade spoke, he could feel the weight of their family's legacy pressing down on him. They had always been a small operation, isolated in the swamp where the law couldn't touch them. But now, as he looked at his brothers, he realized that the game had changed. They were no longer just moonshiners trying to survive. They had become pawns in a much larger game, one that threatened to consume them all. The Dupree brothers weren't just fighting for survival now. They were fighting to protect everything their father had built. And as Wade looked at his brothers, he knew that the only way out of this mess was to fight harder than they ever had before. The swamp, once their sanctuary, was now the battlefield. And the Dupree brothers were ready for war. The days that followed the massacre were long and heavy, weighed down by the aftershocks of what they had done. The Dupree brothers spent their time fortifying their operation and watching their backs. Every creak of the swamp seemed louder now. Every shadow seemed more menacing. They had returned to their hidden stills in the swamp, but the atmosphere was different. The family's world had shifted, and it wasn't just the law they had to worry about anymore. The very foundation of their operation was under threat from an unseen force. Wade, always the leader, sat alone on the porch of their weather-beaten cabin, watching the mist rise from the bayou. He hadn't said much to his brothers in the days since the killings. He couldn't bring himself to. The burden of what they had done weighed on him, and he wasn't sure how to bear it. The loss of life, even those who had wronged them, felt too real now, but he couldn't show weakness, not in front of his brothers. They were depending on him to keep it together. As the sun dipped behind the trees, the rest of the brothers gathered in the cabin's cramped living room. Connor, always quick to action, was cleaning his rifle, his face set in grim determination. Jesse, lost in thought, stared at the floor, his fingers tapping a rhythm only he could hear. Travis was pacing again, as he always did when the tension became unbearable. He was younger than the others, and the weight of the violence they had committed seemed to be taking a toll on him. "We can't keep going like this," Travis said, breaking the silence. His voice was tight, his usual cocky attitude replaced by something darker. You're telling me everything's fine after what we did? After killing 12 men in cold blood? Wade turned to face him, his expression hardening. You think I don't know what we did, Travis? You think I don't feel the weight of it every second? But we did what had to be done. Had to be done? Travis shot back, his voice rising. That's what you keep saying. But the truth is, none of us knew what we were getting into. This isn't just about protecting the business anymore. This is personal, Wade. You knew what that would cost us. We're not the same men we were a week ago. Connor stood up, his patience wearing thin. Enough, Travis, he said. We're not going to sit here and question everything. We did what we had to do to protect this family. What else matters? Jesse, who had been silent until now, spoke up. His voice was quiet, almost too soft, but there was a tension in his words that caught everyone's attention. It matters, Connor. It matters more than any of us want to admit. What we did, it's changed things between us. We can't just keep pretending everything's fine. The room fell into a heavy silence. Jesse's words hung in the air like a fog. Wade knew this was coming. His brothers were feeling the strain, and he could see the cracks beginning to show in the armor they had built around themselves. They had always been united by blood, bound by the same code. But now the weight of their actions was pulling them apart, one fracture at a time. Wade felt a tightness in his chest as he looked at his brothers. He knew that the tension in the room was only a reflection of the tension within their operation. The brothers were no longer a united front. The trust that had always existed between them was beginning to erode, and Wade wasn't sure how much longer they could keep this family together. They had always survived through loyalty and strength, but now their very foundation was beginning to crack. We need to stick together, Wade said, his voice hard but tinged with the strain of his own internal battle. We can't afford to turn on each other, not now. Not after everything we've been through. Connor looked at him, his expression softening slightly. You're right, Wade. We stick together. But you have to trust that we're all in this together. No more secrets, no more lies. We're family. And family doesn't turn its back on each other. The room was still, but for the first time in days, it felt like they were starting to rebuild the bond they had lost. The Dupree brothers were at a crossroads, but in that moment they realized that family was the only thing that mattered. It was the one thing they could rely on when everything else fell apart. The following days were a blur of preparation and paranoia. The Dupree brothers moved swiftly and silently, staying hidden in the swamp like ghosts. The swamp had always been their ally, but now it felt like a trap, closing in around them with each passing hour. Wade's mind raced as he thought about the future of the family business. He knew it couldn't last forever. No matter how much moonshine they produced, no matter how much money they made, the law would eventually catch up to them. And when it did, they wouldn't just lose their freedom, they'd lose everything. Connor, as always, was focused on the task at hand. He had a plan to take down their enemies, a calculated move that he believed would put an end to the growing threat. But Wade wasn't sure. Every step they took seemed to be leading them deeper into a hole they couldn't climb out of. The more they fought to protect what was theirs, the more they seemed to lose themselves in the process. As the brothers gathered in the cabin to discuss their next move, Wade couldn't help but feel the weight of what was coming. They were on the edge, staring into an abyss that they couldn't escape. The law, the rival gangs, even the ghosts of their own pasts, all of it was closing in. Wade knew that once they took the final step, There would be no going back. "We're running out of time," Connor said, his voice calm and steady as he laid out his plan. "We hit them hard. Take out the leaders. Once they're gone, the rest will fall apart." Jesse looked up from the map, his eyes narrowing. "It's too risky. If we take them out, we'll make enemies of everyone, and the law will come for us harder than ever." "We've already crossed that line," Wade said, his voice low and firm. "We can't back down now. If we don't act, we'll lose everything. This is the reckoning. We fight or we die." The brothers stood in silence for a moment, the weight of Wade's words settling over them. They knew what they had to do. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about protecting their family, their legacy, and the only way of life they had ever known. "We do this together," Wade said, his voice steady. "No more hesitation. No more second guessing. This is the only way out." Travis nodded, his youthful enthusiasm returning. "Let's end this." And just like that, the brothers were set on a path that would lead them into a fight that would define their lives forever. The reckoning was coming, and it would either destroy them or make them legends. The night was thick with fog, the kind that seemed to swallow sound and light, leaving everything in a muted haze. The Dupree brothers moved quietly through the Louisiana swamp, their steps muffled by the wet earth beneath their boots. The world around them felt almost suffocating, the air heavy with moisture, the smell of decaying leaves, and the distant hum of nocturnal creatures. It was as if the swamp itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Wade led the way, his senses heightened, his mind focused on the task ahead. The plan was simple. Take out the key players in the rival gang and strike fear into anyone who might be watching. The Dupree brothers had already made their mark, but the real work was just beginning. This wasn't just about reclaiming the stolen barrels of moonshine anymore. It was about sending a message. They reached the clearing where their enemies were gathered. It wasn't much. A few rusted trucks, some makeshift tents, and a fire burning in the center. The group was smaller than Wade had expected, but that didn't make the task any easier. They were heavily armed, and the stillness of the swamp made every sound feel like a warning. Wade turned to his brothers, nodding silently. They had all trained for this moment. Connor, his war-hardened eyes scanning the area, gestured for the others to move into position. Jesse and Travis positioned themselves on either side, ready to cut off any escape routes. The brothers were ready to strike, together as they always had. The moment the first shot rang out, everything fell into chaos. The men by the fire froze, eyes wide with shock. Before they could react, Connor fired again, the loud crack of his rifle cutting through the night. The gunfire echoed through the swamp, a signal that the Dupree brothers had arrived. The men scattered, trying to reach for their weapons, but it was too late. Wade was already on them, his revolver drawn and steady as he aimed at the nearest target. The swamp was no longer a place of refuge. It was a battleground. Travis, always eager for action, charged forward, tackling one of the men to the ground. He was fast, brutal, and efficient, the adrenaline of the fight pumping through his veins. Jesse, meanwhile, took a more calculated approach, using the shadows to his advantage as he picked off his targets from a distance. Every shot was precise, every move deliberate. For a moment it seemed like the swamp was alive with violence. The once quiet murmur of the world around them was replaced by the sounds of men falling, shouting, and dying. The Dupree brothers had unleashed the full force of their anger and desperation, and there was no turning back. When the last of the rival gang members had fallen, the swamp returned to its eerie silence. The battle was over, but the cost was already clear. The brothers stood over the bodies, their breaths heavy and labored. Wade's heart raced, his pulse still pounding in his ears. He looked around at his brothers, each of them breathless, covered in sweat and dirt. They had done what they set out to do. They had reclaimed what was theirs. But in the quiet aftermath, Wade couldn't shake the feeling that something was still missing. The swamp's wrath had been unleashed, and in doing so, they had crossed a line that would change everything. The fog slowly began to lift, but the weight of the night's violence lingered. The Dupree brothers stood in the clearing, surrounded by the bodies of their enemies. The stillness of the swamp was deafening now, a stark contrast to the chaos that had just unfolded. Wade felt a cold chill run down his spine as he looked at the lifeless forms around him. They had done what they had to do, but at what cost? In the eerie quiet, Jesse was the first to speak. His voice was softer than usual, carrying a sense of disbelief. "Is it over?" he asked, looking around at the fallen men. His hand trembled slightly as he wiped sweat from his brow, his rifle still in his grip. "What happens now?" Wade didn't answer immediately. He couldn't. The weight of what they had just done pressed heavily on his chest, a suffocating reminder of the line they had crossed. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It wasn't even about protecting the family business. They had killed, mercilessly, without hesitation, and there was no going back. "We finish it," Wade said finally, his voice low, filled with a quiet resolve. "There's no turning back now. We've got to wipe out any trace of this. Anyone who knows what happened, anyone who could come after us has to be dealt with." Connor nodded, his face hardening. "It's done. We've done what we had to do. Now we make sure it stays buried." But as Wade looked at his brothers, he could see the doubt in their eyes. They weren't sure, not yet, whether this would be the end. The shadows of the swamp seemed to close in around them, and Wade knew that their actions would haunt them for the rest of their lives. They worked quickly to cover their tracks, burying the bodies in the shallow water of the swamp, making sure that there was no evidence left behind. As they worked, Wade couldn't shake the feeling that they were leaving behind more than just bodies. The legacy of violence they had created would follow them, forever entwined with the family's name. When the job was done, they returned to the cabin in silence. The fog had lifted, and the morning sun was beginning to break through the thick trees. But the light felt hollow, as though it couldn't reach them in the way it once had. Wade stood at the porch of the cabin, his gaze fixed on the horizon. The swamp stretched out before him as vast and unyielding as it always had been. But it felt different now. It felt like a place of judgment. "You ever think we're not going to get out of this?" Travis asked from behind him. His voice was quiet, but there was a rawness to it, something Wade had never heard before. Wade didn't turn around, but he could feel his brother's eyes on him. "We have to get out of this," he said. "We don't have a choice." Not anymore. But deep down, Wade knew the truth. They were already trapped. The swamp had claimed them, body and soul, and there was no escape from the blood they had spilled. Their legacy, once defined by survival and family, had become something darker. And in the silence that followed, Wade realized that they were not just running from the law, they were running from themselves. The days that followed the massacre were filled with a sense of unease, a thick fog that had nothing to do with the swamp. The Dupree brothers worked in silence, their minds preoccupied with what had transpired. The moonshine barrels were back in their possession, but the cost was becoming clear. The swamp had always been their home, their place of refuge, but now it felt like a cage. The brothers knew that they couldn't stay here forever. They had made their mark, but now there was no escaping the consequences. Wade paced back and forth in the cabin, the wooden floor creaking under his boots. His mind was racing, thinking about the future, about the law, about the families of the men they had killed, about the message they had sent. He didn't regret what they'd done, but he knew it would come back to haunt them. The weight of their actions was starting to settle in, and Wade felt it pressing against his chest like a vice. "Wade, you've got to stop pacing," Travis said, his voice tense. He was sitting at the table, fiddling with a shotgun. "We're not going to outrun this. We've already crossed the line. We've got blood on our hands." Wade stopped in his tracks and turned to face his brother. "I know that, Travis, but what choice do we have? We either face the consequences or we disappear." The youngest brother, always the most impulsive, stood up, his eyes flashing with anger. "You're talking like we've already lost. We haven't lost anything. We took care of business and that's it. The rest will take care of itself." Connor, who had been silent until now, finally spoke up. "It's not that simple, Travis," he said, his voice low and steady. "We can't just pretend this didn't happen. We've made enemies, and they won't forget what we did. They'll come for us sooner or later." Jesse, sitting off to the side, looked up from his maps. "It's not just about enemies either. It's the weight of what we've done. Killing's easy when it's someone you don't care about. But we've changed. We're not the same people anymore." The words hung in the air, heavy with the truth none of them wanted to acknowledge. The brothers had always been united by blood and a shared history. But now that bond was fraying. They had crossed a line, and they could feel the pull of something darker creeping into their hearts. Their operation, their family, everything was at stake now. "We're stuck, Wade," Jesse said, his voice softer than usual. "You know that, right? There's no turning back. Not for any of us." Wade's shoulders slumped. He had known this day would come, but hearing it out loud made it feel more real. They had made the decision to protect what was theirs, to take revenge for the theft of their moonshine. But in doing so, they had become something else, something dangerous. "I don't regret it," Wade said finally, his voice hoarse, "but I know the cost, and we're going to have to pay it one way or another." The brothers sat in silence, each of them contemplating the path they had chosen. The sun was setting outside, casting an orange glow across the swamp. It should have been peaceful, but all Wade could feel was the heaviness in his chest. They had taken lives, and now they would live with the consequences. The air was thick with tension in the cabin as the days wore on. The brothers had always been close, bound together by blood and the shared responsibility of running the family's moonshine operation. But now the cracks were starting to show. The violence they had unleashed was more than just a battle with their enemies. It was a battle within themselves. Wade couldn't help but notice the subtle changes in his brothers. Travis, once brimming with confidence, now seemed restless, constantly on edge. He had always been the impulsive one, but now there was a coldness to him that Wade hadn't seen before. It was as though the blood they had spilled had infected him in a way that was hard to shake off. Connor, ever the calm one, had become distant, his usual stoic demeanor replaced with a quiet anger that simmered just beneath the surface. Wade knew that Vietnam had changed him, but now it seemed like the war was still ongoing in his mind, and the battlefield was no longer just in foreign lands. It was here, in their home, in the very heart of the swamp. Jesse, the thoughtful one, had become increasingly withdrawn, spending more time studying the maps and the old family journals. Wade had always trusted Jesse's intelligence, but now his brother seemed more obsessed with the past than the present. It was as if he was trying to find a way out, a way to escape the reality they had created. The brothers had always been able to communicate without words, but now the silence between them was deafening. There were no easy answers, no simple solutions. Every move they made felt like it was driving them further into a corner, and the walls were closing in fast. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Wade stood on the porch, staring out into the dense swamp. The fog was beginning to roll in again, just like it had that fateful night. He could hear the sounds of the swamp, the distant croak of frogs, the rustle of the trees in the breeze. But this time, it didn't feel comforting. It felt suffocating. Behind him, he heard footsteps. Turning, he saw Connor approach, his rifle slung over his shoulder. The older brother didn't say anything at first, just stood beside him, looking out at the same view. Finally, it was Connor who broke the silence. "We're falling apart, Wade," he said quietly, his voice low, like he was afraid of the words himself. "This isn't just about moonshine anymore. This is about everything we've become." Wade swallowed hard, knowing the truth in Connor's words. They had always been a family, bound by loyalty, by honor. But now that loyalty was being tested in ways they had never imagined. Each of them was struggling to reconcile the men they were with the actions they had taken. And in that struggle, the brothers were beginning to drift apart. "Maybe we were always like this," Wade said, his voice heavy. "Maybe we were always headed down this path. But now there's no turning back." Connor nodded, his gaze still fixed on the swamp. "No, there's no going back now." As the night deepened, the brothers stood in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. The swamp, once their home, now felt like a prison, and they were trapped inside it, unable to escape the legacy they had created, and the family that was beginning to unravel. The swamp had always been a place of refuge, a sanctuary where the Dupree brothers could retreat from the world. But now the dense trees and murky waters felt like a suffocating trap. Every crack of a branch, every gust of wind, felt like an omen. Wade stood at the edge of their hidden cabin, staring into the thick fog that rolled over the bayou like a living thing. The air was thick with the smell of decay, the sound of distant croaking frogs and rustling leaves, the only things that broke the silence. It was a stillness that threatened to break at any moment, and Wade could feel the pressure building in his chest. Behind him he heard footsteps, his brothers walking toward him, one by one. They hadn't said much in the past few days, the quiet between them growing heavier with each passing hour. Wade had always been their leader, the one to make the hard decisions. But now he felt like he was the one on the edge, about to break. "What are we waiting for?" Travis's voice broke through the silence, sharp and impatient. The youngest brother had always been eager for action, but now there was something else in his tone, something darker. "We've already killed 12 men. What's stopping us from finishing this once and for all?" Wade turned, his face grim. "It's not that simple, Travis. You know that. We can't just go in guns blazing." "We already did," Connor chimed in, his voice steady but filled with a quiet bitterness. "We've crossed every line there is. There's no going back." Jesse, standing off to the side, looked down at the ground, his fingers absent-mindedly tracing a line in the dirt. "We never asked for this," he said, almost to himself. "This wasn't the life we chose, but now it feels like it's the only life we have left." Wade's heart sank as he looked at his brothers. They were right. The world they had built, the moonshine business, their tight family bonds, had unraveled before their eyes. They had taken lives, crossed lines that could never be uncrossed, and now they were stuck in a nightmare of their own making. "We have to do it," Wade said, his voice barely above a whisper. "We've got no choice. We can't let this go. We can't let anyone think they can take what's ours." The words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of their inevitability. Wade had always believed in protecting what was his, but now the cost of that protection was becoming too high to ignore. They had already killed to defend their legacy, to protect their family's name, but the path they were on had no end in sight. And with every step they took, the darkness inside them grew stronger. "Then let's finish it," Travis said, his voice eager once again. The fire in his eyes was unmistakable. "Let's make sure no one ever dares to cross us again." The brothers gathered their gear, their rifles, and their resolve. The final hour was upon them. The swamp would either swallow them whole, or it would be the place where they made their last stand. Wade didn't know which, but he knew that once they left the cabin, they wouldn't be coming back. The end was near, and there was nothing more to do but face it. The truck rumbled down the narrow, muddy road, its headlights cutting through the dense fog. The brothers sat in silence, the tension between them thick enough to cut with a knife. Wade gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white as he concentrated on the road ahead. He could feel the weight of the decision pressing on him. This wasn't just another job. It wasn't just about getting back what had been stolen. This was personal. "We're doing the right thing, right?" Jesse asked, his voice quieter than usual. He had always been the thoughtful one, the one who tried to see the bigger picture. But now even he was beginning to question everything they had done. Wade didn't answer immediately. He didn't have to. They all knew the answer. There was no right thing left to do. They had crossed the line, and there was no turning back. The thought of turning around and walking away never even crossed Wade's mind. He couldn't stop now, not after everything they had sacrificed, everything they had lost. Connor's voice broke the silence. "It doesn't matter, Jesse. We're too far in." We either finish this or we die trying. Wade glanced at his brother, his expression hardening. Connor's right. We've made our bed. Now we lie in it. The truck bounced along the dirt path, and Wade's thoughts drifted back to the days before all of this. Before the betrayal, before the violence, when things had been simpler. They had been a family then, a team. But now, as the fog swallowed them whole, Wade realized how much had changed. They had become something else, something darker. And in that darkness, he couldn't help but feel that the bond between them had started to fray. Wade, Travis's voice brought him back to the present. You sure about this? About going all the way with it? Wade's grip tightened on the wheel. We have no choice, Travis. We've come this far. If we don't do this now, we'll lose everything. The business, the family, it's all on the line. I'm not talking about the business, Travis said, his voice tense. I'm talking about us. You can feel it, can't you? Something's different. We're not the same anymore. It's like we're strangers. Wade's jaw tightened. That's not true. It is, Travis pressed. We're not who we used to be, and I don't know how to fix that. The words hit Wade harder than he expected. They had always been brothers. They had always fought together. But now, with the blood of their enemies on their hands, the foundation of their family was beginning to crack. Stop it, Travis, Connor said sharply. We don't have time for this. This isn't the time to question what we've done. We finish this and then we deal with whatever comes next. Wade felt a pang of guilt wash over him as he glanced at Travis in the rearview mirror. The youngest brother's eyes were filled with doubt, something Wade had never seen before. The cost of their actions was beginning to break them apart piece by piece. The truck screeched to a halt as they reached the clearing where the final showdown would take place. Wade took a deep breath, his heart racing. He could feel the weight of the moment. This was it, the final chapter. Whether they survived it or not was a question that hung in the air, unanswered. But the one thing Wade knew for sure was this. After tonight, nothing would ever be the same again. The moon hung high over the bayou, casting a cold, silvery light over the swamp. The Dupree brothers stood at the edge of the clearing, their rifles ready, their faces hard with resolve. The place was eerily quiet. The usual chorus of night creatures was missing, and the only sound was the low murmur of the wind moving through the cypress trees. It felt like the calm before a storm, and Wade couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them. Are we ready for this? Connor asked, his voice low, as if speaking too loudly might alert something in the shadows. He had his rifle slung across his chest, his eyes scanning the darkened tree line for any signs of movement. Wade nodded. This ends tonight. No more games. The brothers had tracked their enemies to this remote location deep in the swamp, a place so far removed from civilization that it almost felt like another world. But Wade knew better than to think they were alone. This was no longer just about moonshine. It was about survival, family, and reclaiming the power that had been taken from them. And with each passing day, it felt like the walls were closing in. This is too quiet, Jesse murmured, his eyes narrowing as he peered into the darkness. His instincts were always sharp, and tonight they were telling him that something wasn't right. I've got a bad feeling about this. Travis shifted nervously. You think they're laying in wait for us? It's too damn quiet. No one's making a sound. Stay focused. Wade ordered. His voice was steady, but his heart was pounding. He had never been one to show fear, but the weight of the situation was starting to get to him. The thought of what they were about to do, the violence, the bloodshed, was enough to make him feel uneasy. But there was no turning back now. They had come too far. Too much had already been lost. Connor pulled out a map, his fingers tracing the lines of the swamp, marking out the path they would take. They'll be hiding in those old cabins. They think they've got the upper hand, but they don't know we've been tracking them. They won't see us coming. Wade studied the map, his mind racing through the plan. They would strike fast, strike hard, and take down anyone who stood in their way. This wasn't a fight for survival. It was a war. A war to reclaim their legacy. "We move in 10 minutes, Wade said, his voice unwavering. He wasn't about to show weakness now, not when everything they had worked for was on the line. As the brothers moved into position, Wade couldn't help but reflect on everything that had led them to this point. They had started as a family, bound by a common goal. The moonshine had been their way of life, a tradition passed down from their father. But now it was a symbol of something darker. It was the thing that had cost them their innocence, their peace. And tonight, they would either reclaim it or lose it forever. The air was thick with tension as the Dupree brothers closed in on the cabins. Every step felt heavier than the last. Wade's hand tightened around his rifle as they moved through the brush, each man silently marking his target. They had planned this moment for days, tracking their enemies through the swamp, learning their routines. Now it was time to end it. Connor led the charge, his military experience evident in the way he moved. Calm, calculated, and precise. Wade followed closely behind, his eyes fixed on the cabin ahead. Jesse and Travis were positioned on either side, waiting for the signal to strike. The brothers were a unit, a force to be reckoned with, and they had learned over the years that when you moved through the swamp, you moved with purpose. There was no room for hesitation, no room for second guessing. The enemy had to be eliminated. As they neared the cabin, Wade's pulse quickened. His thoughts raced, and for the first time in a long while, doubt crept into his mind. This wasn't just about reclaiming their stolen property anymore. This was about pride, about showing the world and themselves that the Dupree family would not be pushed aside. "On my signal," Wade whispered, his voice steady despite the storm brewing inside him. "We move in fast, get them all." Connor nodded, his face grim. "We'll take the lead, make it clean." With a final glance around, Wade gave the signal. The brothers exploded into motion, moving with the precision of a well-oiled machine. The door to the cabin was already open, and they rushed inside, rifles raised. The men inside were caught off guard, scrambling to reach for their weapons. But it was too late. Wade fired first, his shot piercing the darkness and silencing the chaos in an instant. The brothers moved quickly, clearing the cabin with ruthless efficiency. One by one, their enemies fell, the sound of gunfire echoing through the swamp. It was over in minutes, the last of their adversaries dropping to the ground with a final gurgling breath. Wade stood in the center of the room, his rifle still smoking, as his brothers moved to secure the perimeter. There was no triumph in his chest, no sense of victory, just a cold emptiness that filled the space where pride once lived. The swamp outside remained silent, but it wasn't the peace Wade had once known. It was the stillness of finality, of endings that could never be undone. They had crossed the line, and now there was no going back. "Is it done?" Jesse asked, his voice low, almost distant. Wade nodded, his throat dry. "It's done." But as they left the cabin, moving toward their truck, Wade couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The swamp had witnessed everything: the blood, the violence, the rage. And in that silence, Wade realized that the swamp had claimed them all. There was no redemption, no escape. The Dupree brothers were a part of the swamp now, forever bound to its murky waters, its blood-soaked earth. And they would never be able to outrun the consequences of what they had done. The truck rolled slowly through the swamp, its tires crunching over the gravel path, the fog creeping along the edges of the road like a warning. The Dupree brothers had finished what they set out to do, but the aftermath was something they hadn't anticipated. The bond that had once held them together now felt fragile, like a thread stretched too tight. Wade's eyes flickered to his brothers in the rearview mirror. Connor stared out the window, his face hard and unreadable. Jesse sat with his hands clenched in his lap, the weight of their actions sitting heavy between them. Travis, always the loudest, was silent, his usual bravado stripped away by the violence they had just committed. The silence in the truck was suffocating. "We're done, aren't we?" Travis's voice broke the stillness, but there was no pride in it, no satisfaction. "We're done when I say we're done," Wade replied, his voice cold. But the words didn't come out with the same authority they once had. He had led them into this, but now he wasn't sure what kind of man he had become in the process. Connor spoke, his tone sharp. "You're the one who's holding us together, Wade, but you're losing us. We can't keep doing this. We're tearing apart." The weight of those words hit Wade harder than anything. They had been brothers, family, bound by blood in the swamp. But now it felt like they were drifting, each of them lost in the mess they had created. He gripped the wheel tighter, the reality of it sinking in. They had won, but at what cost? Days passed in a blur, the brothers staying hidden in the swamp, their nerves raw and taut. Wade couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming for them, that the past was catching up with them faster than they could outrun it. They couldn't stay in the swamp forever. The law was out there, and so were their enemies. But the worst part wasn't the law. It was the gnawing feeling that their actions were inevitable, that there was no escape from what they had become. As they packed up their remaining supplies, Wade knew it was time to leave. The chase had begun. They couldn't hide forever. The swamp had been their sanctuary, but now it was just a trap. "We need to move," Wade said quietly to his brothers. "We leave tonight. Keep your heads down." But even as he spoke the words, Wade knew it was already too late. The game was over. The chase had begun, and the only question left was whether they would survive it. Their family, their legacy, everything was slipping through their fingers. They were running from more than just the law. They were running from themselves. The journey through the swamp had become a slow crawl, weighed down by the knowledge that there was nowhere left to run. Wade and his brothers moved in silence, each of them haunted by the choices they had made and the blood they had spilled. They had been a family once, bound by their shared past, their bond to the swamp, and their father's legacy. But now that bond was strained, frayed to the breaking point. The brothers were no longer the united front they once were. They had become strangers to each other, each carrying the weight of their actions in different ways. Wade had always been the leader, the one who kept them together through every challenge. But now even he couldn't escape the feeling of being lost. The weight of everything they had done pressed on him like a vice. The last few days had been spent moving in and out of hiding, trying to stay one step ahead of the law. But it was clear they couldn't keep running forever. Eventually, their past would catch up to them. As they approached their final destination, an abandoned barn deep in the heart of the swamp, Wade felt the familiar pull of the land, the place where it all started. But this time, it felt different. This wasn't the home he had known. It was a place of finality, where they would either make their stand or disappear into the night. Connor, who had been quieter than usual, was the first to break the silence. "This is it, isn't it?" he asked, his voice low, as if speaking too loudly might make the truth unbearable. Wade nodded, his jaw tightening. "This is where it ends." But even as he said it, Wade couldn't shake the nagging doubt. Could they really just end it here? Was this their fate? One last stand, followed by a life in prison or worse? Or had the cost of their actions already sealed their fate? The brothers gathered their weapons, prepared for whatever would come. But this time, the weight wasn't just the law. It wasn't just about surviving. It was the price they had paid. The family, the swamp, the moonshine, everything they had fought for had brought them to this point. And now they were standing on the precipice of something that could never be undone. Wade's heart raced as he led them into the barn, his thoughts consumed by the finality of it all. They were no longer running. They were facing their end. Hay and decaying wood. The walls creaked with the weight of the years, and the only sound was the distant croak of frogs in the swamp. Inside, the brothers moved like shadows, gathering their thoughts for what might be their final moments. They had come to the place where it all started, the place where their father had taught them the ways of the swamp, the ways of survival. But this was no longer the family they had once been. The brotherhood, the trust that had held them together, had long since shattered. In the end, it had come down to survival. And now, with the law closing in, with the blood of their enemies on their hands, there was nothing left but the consequences of their choices. Wade stood at the center of the barn, his rifle steady in his hands. His brothers were positioned around him, each of them tense, waiting for the inevitable. The fog outside seemed to press in on them, a thick, suffocating veil that mirrored the heaviness in Wade's chest. "We finish this," Wade said, his voice low but resolute. The words were a command, but they felt like an apology. They had made their decisions, and now there was no going back. The brothers exchanged silent glances. They had fought side by side for years, But now, in the quiet of the barn, they realized how far they had drifted. Each of them was carrying the weight of what had been lost: family, honor, respect. The swamp had once been their home, a place of sanctuary, but now it felt like a tomb. The sound of distant engines reached their ears. The law. It was coming for them. The end of their reign. The end of everything they had fought to protect. "We don't run anymore," Wade said, his voice breaking the silence. "We face this. Together." The brothers nodded, their resolve hardening. They had come this far, and now they would see it through. They would face the consequences of their actions, whatever they might be. The door to the barn creaked open, and the brothers readied their weapons. The law had come to collect what was owed. But what the law didn't understand was that the Dupree brothers had already paid the price. They had paid it in blood, in betrayal, and in a legacy that would never be forgotten. As the first headlights pierced through the fog, Wade looked at his brothers one last time. They had fought to survive, to protect what was theirs. And now, as the law descended upon them, they would face the end with the same unwavering strength that had brought them this far. In the end, their legacy would not be defined by the law, by the violence, or by the bloodshed. It would be defined by the family they had lost and the cost of the choices they had made, a legacy of blood, a legacy that would haunt the swamp forever.